Hamda, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this ExChangeWales webinar on understanding suicide risk in parent carers of children with disabilities. I'm Dan Burrows. I'm a senior lecturer in social work in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, and I'm going to be chairing the session today and also chipping in a little bit because I've worked with Siobhan on some of the work that she's done in this area. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Siobhan O'Dwyer, who is Associate Professor of Social Care at Birmingham University, who is going to lead the session. So over to you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Dan. So before we start, I just want to do a little bit of a content warning. I realize you've signed up for a session about suicide risk, but there's still the possibility that as we go along with this, you might just think, oh, today's not the day for this. So it's totally fine if you need to step out, if you need to mute me for a bit and come back. Your well-being is the most important thing today, so do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about some research that we've done around suicide risk in parents of disabled and seriously ill children. I realise this is probably quite an educated group and quite experienced in this space, so I really don't want to teach you to suck eggs. So I'm not going to start with a broad background on childhood disability or parent carers. I'll just launch straight into the background for this particular research. And I should say, I'll probably speak, Dan, I'll probably speak for about 20, 25 minutes, and then there'll be lots of time for discussion and questions and feedback.
Thanks, Siobhan. Just to jump in there on that note, if you have questions and comments along the way, please do feel free to put them into the chat. And when we have time for questions and comments, I can read those out. And also when we have time for the questions and comments, if you prefer to put your comment verbally, if you can press the raise your hand button, and when we see that, we'll get round to you and we'll get your mic turned on so that you can speak. Sorry, Siobhan, to jump
That's
in, but
grand.
yeah.
So to give you a bit of background, there's a growing body of evidence that shows unpaid carers are a high-risk group for suicide. So in people caring for family members with dementia, for example, about 16% have thought about suicide while they were caring. It's around 70% for people caring for a parent or a partner with cancer. But there's been almost no research on parent carers. And having done quite a lot of the research on people caring for family members with dementia or cancer or other conditions, I had a hunch that parent carers might be at even higher risk of suicide. Because although caring for a family member with dementia is incredibly tough, it's time limited, so it's maybe 5 years, 10 years at the outside. And there are really socially acceptable ways for ending that caring role, for saying, I can't do this anymore. So you move the person into a care home, for example. But for parents of disabled children, being a carer is for the rest of your life. And there are no socially acceptable ways to say, I can't do this anymore. So together with Dan and colleagues from the University of Exeter, the University of Bristol and Warwick University, we set out to answer 3 questions. So the first was, how many parent carers have thought about suicide? The second was, what factors put them at risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviours? And by behaviours here, I mean attempts. And what needs to happen in policy and practice to support at-risk carers and prevent deaths by suicide? So to answer these questions, we surveyed 750 parent carers from across England. Unfortunately, we didn't include Wales just for logistical reasons, but there's no reason to think that these results don't also apply to Wales or to Northern Ireland or to Scotland for that matter. And then we did in-depth interviews with a subset of those. And it's really important to note here that this research was co-produced with parent carers. So we consulted a group of parent carers before we even applied for the research funding to make sure that this was actually an issue that they thought researchers should be exploring. And then 4 of those carers became co-investigators on the research. So working hand in hand with academics at every stage of the process to ensure that the research was informed by carers' experiences and could help address carers' needs. So in the surveys, we found that 42% of parents had experienced suicidal thoughts or behaviours while caring for their disabled child. And again, by behaviours here, I mean they'd made a plan to end their life or they'd already attempted to end their life. More than 2/3 of those carers, so just under 30% overall, had experienced those thoughts in the previous 12 months. Now, for context, approximately 5% of the general population have thought about suicide in the previous 12 months. So these numbers are really off the charts in terms of the general population. Parent carers are contemplating suicide at much higher rates than the general population and more than double what we see in other unpaid groups, other groups of unpaid carers. What's even more concerning is that more than half of the parent carers who reported suicidal thoughts in our study said they had never told anyone they were feeling this way. So fear, judgment, and stigma were the reasons people didn't want to share that they'd been thinking about suicide with family or professionals, particularly the fear that their child would be taken away from them. That was the biggest fear that parents told us when we asked about suicidal thoughts and behaviours. The second most common fear was that they would be sectioned. We also found 4 key risk factors, so things that made it more likely that a carer would think about suicide. Entrapment, which is a word that basically means feeling so trapped by your circumstances that death feels like the only way out. Dysfunctional coping, so things like drinking too much, eating too much, taking more medication than you've been prescribed, or using illicit substances. Depression, and having a mental health diagnosis before the person became a carer. So these were the things that made it more likely that a parent carer would think about suicide. And it's really easy when it comes to suicide for policymakers and clinicians to focus on the mental illness and the dysfunctional coping in this list of risk factors and say, well, let's just give them antidepressants and 6 sessions of CBT and then send them on their way. But even though dysfunctional coping and mental illness are risk factors, more than half the carers in our study who reported suicidal thoughts had not received a mental health diagnosis prior to becoming a carer, and more than a third didn't have a current mental illness. So antidepressants and CBT, while very effective in some regards, aren't going to be the whole answer when it comes to preventing deaths by suicide in parent carers. And we actually need to look more closely at that sense of feeling trapped, which likely comes before the dysfunctional coping and the depression. And in our interviews, that's exactly how carers talked about the factors that contributed to suicidal thoughts and behaviours. Really that this sense of being trapped came before feelings of depression and use of dysfunctional coping strategies. In particular, they talked about how being a parent carer meant you had to be more than a parent. What you did day to day, the expectations of you day to day was so much more than what was expected and what needed to be done by parents of same age children without disabilities. Parent carers in our interviews also said they were constantly having to fight and battle to get their children even the most basic of support. They were constantly being scrutinised and judged by service providers and professionals. They weren't being seen or understood or supported by friends or family or services. They had very little choice or control in the caring role. And because they were dealing with all of this all the time, they didn't have time to prioritise their own health and well-being. They also told us that all of these things were interconnected and that when they happened over and over again, month on month, year on year, that's when they started to feel trapped and suicide felt like the only way out. In the interviews, it also became really clear that when parents didn't feel like they could act on their suicidal thoughts because they knew no one would take care of their child if they weren't around, some parents also experienced thoughts of homicide suicide, so ending their child's life and then ending their own life. And I should say, although we talk about this sense of entrapment as a feeling, I think for parent carers, it's not irrational. It's a very objective assessment that actually they are trapped in this situation. They are trapped in this system and there isn't a way out. It's really important to note here that for logistical reasons, this study was focused on parents of children under 18, but we know that these experiences aren't limited to those parents, and that parents of adult children with disabilities also experience these thoughts and feelings, particularly as their child transitions out of children's services and into adult services, and then as they start to age and wonder who'll care for their child when they're not around. Although this study provides really clear evidence of suicide risk in parent carers, it doesn't tell us how many parent carers have actually died by suicide. And that data actually isn't available anywhere because caring status isn't part of the data that's routinely collected when a person dies by suicide. And the problem with that, and Dan will talk about this a bit later on in terms of next steps, but the problem with that is a lot of the policy work that's done around suicide prevention when policymakers decide who should be the priority groups for initiatives to prevent suicide, it's based on death data. And so it's really difficult at the moment to get carers recognised as a priority group for suicide prevention. But given the high rates of suicidal thinking, if more than 40% of parent carers are thinking about ending their lives, I don't think we should be waiting for the death data before we take action to support at-risk parent carers. Where we do have death data, though, is in terms of homicides. So I mentioned on this slide about the interviews that some parent carers also think about ending their child's life, and we do have death data for that. So in a separate piece of research, we found that there are, on average, 13 homicides or homicide-suicides perpetrated by unpaid carers each year in England and Wales. And 1 to 2 of these each year involves a parent carer killing a disabled child, both a child, including children under 18, but also adult children. From these deaths, we know that when parent carers kill, it's usually mothers, and it's usually for one of 2 reasons. Either they want to end their child's suffering, but they can't bear to keep living after they've done that. Or they're so completely overwhelmed by the caring role and the situation they're in that they want to die, but they can't bear to leave their child behind. We also know that there are some cases, some homicides, usually perpetrated by fathers or stepfathers, where a child with a disability is killed as the end point in a long-standing pattern of domestic violence. We also know there are some parent carers whose child dies after an extended period of neglect, but for those of you working in frontline services, you're very unlikely to see those cases in your practice because they're usually not connected to services. So the ones to be paying attention to are the ones where a child is at the end of their life or is in huge amounts of pain, has no quality of life, or where there's a history of domestic violence in the family. So our research has really clearly shown that parents of disabled children are a high-risk group for suicide and homicide, and there's a very obvious need for urgent action to support at-risk carers and prevent deaths by suicide. So we have a bit of a wish list of things we think need to happen to start to work on this, and I'm going to hand over to Dan to talk through some of this stuff, both at a bigger picture, then at a more local level, and then also about what you can be doing right now in your practice. So Dan, I'll mute myself and hand over to you, and just let me know when you want me to change the slides.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so some of the important national strategies, and I think these clearly these cut across different national governments. So this is stuff that the Westminster government needs to think about. For us here in Wales, our own Welsh government, and of course for the other devolved administrations, they need to be thinking about this. And a really important point is that services for disabled children are an important factor for helping to protect from the risk of parental suicide. And I think in calling for improvement to services for disabled children, I think it's worth acknowledging that there are pockets of real excellence in support of disabled children, but there isn't necessarily the consistency that is required. And in some of the work I've carried out, for example, I remember one parent commenting who had a child who was initially treated for cancer and then had long-term disabilities after the cancer was successfully treated. And she said that while the child was receiving treatment, the support that the family received was absolutely first rate. But then the organisation that supported them only worked with children on active treatment. And then once that was finished, the services simply weren't of the same level. And while she didn't need the same intensity of services, she did need ongoing services, and they weren't provided as well. So I think it's worth noting that what we really need is consistency in the services that are provided. Something else that comes under improvement of services for disabled children is the importance of schools. And again, some messages from research that I've been part of in which we've spoken to parent carers of disabled children is that where parents have children in special schools, they often get really excellent support, and they get a community network, and they get good understanding and good peer support through that. But for disabled children who are schooled in mainstream schools, the same understanding of the challenges for parent carers may not be there. So that's something that's really important to address. In terms of access to information about services, a really important concept is that of there being no wrong door for parent carers, so that if a parent carer asks for help, they don't get sent around, okay, well, we're not the right person, you need to contact that person, that person, that person, and so on, because carers do often report getting sent from place to place, and this constant battle to be heard, and that needs to stop. And we really need to make sure that when someone reports, I'm having a real difficulty here, and they come to a professional service, that professional service is able to help pilot them to the right service, even if they're not the right service at that time, that they pilot them to the right service without just sending them on this sort of merry-go-round of knocking on doors or ringing telephone numbers. And in terms of carer strategies, I know in England there isn't a carer strategy yet in full publication. I know it's being developed. In Wales, we do have a carer strategy, and it has 4 priority areas, which are to identify and value unpaid carers, to ensure that carers are provided with information, advice, and assistance, to support the lives of carers alongside caring, and to support carers with employment and education. And there isn't a recognition, while there's lots of good things about the Welsh strategy for carers, and I think it's been broadly welcomed by carers advocacy groups, it doesn't specifically address suicide prevention as a priority. And as Siobhan has highlighted, there is this lack of data about how many carers are dying by suicide. So alongside prioritising suicide prevention, in any carer strategy, there also needs to be in suicide prevention strategies priority of carers. And while we don't have the data to say how many carers are dying by suicide yet, yes, we need to collect that data. That needs to be prioritized in how we record data about people who die by suicide, but also we really need to ensure that carers are prioritized in the light of the really stark findings of this study. In terms of the Welsh strategy, it's really interesting that the third prong of the Welsh strategy is to support life alongside caring, and alongside thinking about the more emergency end of suicide prevention, thinking about how to support people when they are experiencing suicidal thoughts. There's a lot more work, I think, that can be done around preventing suicide. And something that I've been exploring with fellow researchers is the importance of fun. And it might sound frivolous in the middle of a presentation about suicide risk to talk about fun, but actually thinking about the sort of the wider preventative picture. It is really important to consider how entrapment, the feelings of entrapment, can lead people towards a path where suicidal ideation starts to come up. And actually, alongside things like, people being able to do things like work, engage with education, and those sort of things that are really important, it is also really important, I think, for professionals when they're talking to carers. I mean, this certainly applies to parent carers, but I think it applies to all carers, to talk about how people go about enjoying themselves, and that means both times when carers and the person cared for get to enjoy time together, and times when they get to have a break from caring and do something that is just for fun. And it doesn't need to be expensive, but sometimes thinking creatively can be, can make a little bit of funding go a long way. And I think sometimes there's a tendency, if for example, if local authorities are going to give grants to fund things, that they might fund things that sound virtuous. So things like, giving someone, or giving someone help to get a gym membership. Well, that sounds virtuous because it's something healthy. But for example, for a young carer, supporting them to get a PlayStation 5 so that they can play online with their friends, so that they can stay connected with friends even if they can't leave the house, for example, that might go just as far in helping them not develop those feelings of entrapment and not go down that path. But I think, particularly for parent carers, where they have such a long trajectory of being a carer ahead of them, it is really important not to ignore the idea of fun as a really important preventative tool. In terms of local strategies, it's really important to think about developing proactive support for parent carers. So actually making sure that parent carers are identified and engaged with, particularly where children are in mainstream schooling, for example, thinking about how do parent carers who may be at risk, how are they identified and how are they supported? And I think it's really important for all professionals who work with parent carers to at least routinely consider the possibility of suicide risk. So, for example, that doesn't mean that we necessarily want there to be, when a carer's assessment is done, we want there to be a tick box saying, is this person suicidal? I mean, I think that is the last thing that we would be advocating. But actually, people, when they're talking to parent carers, should be talking about how is your mental health, how are your feelings, and not be afraid to go there and ask, are you having suicidal thoughts, if they do disclose that they're in a particularly dark place at that time. And that takes training. So that professionals have the confidence to be able to do that, to go there. And clearly, sometimes people do get into a crisis, and when people are in crisis, then they need there to be emergency respite care. That could be in the form of short breaks. It could be in the form of additional help within the home, and crisis support needs to be available for people. Next slide then, please, Siobhan. In terms of what practitioners supporting parent carers can do, the most important thing really is to listen, and to be prepared to spend the time allowing someone to vent, allowing someone to express their feelings, and allowing someone to feel safe to express their feelings. Where people are expressing feelings of suicidal ideation, it's really important to show that understanding, to reassure people, and even to normalize the fact that people do experience some really difficult thoughts, that being a parent carer is not easy. It can be extremely difficult for parent carers. And having to ask for help does not mean that a parent carer is failing. And it's really important to reassure that it is okay to ask for help, and it is okay to need help. It's really important to be able to signpost to services. One of the most important ones is the Samaritans. The numbers there on the slide. So always make sure, if you're aware that you might go into a situation where someone potentially is needing that support, to have the Samaritans number available to them. Not just that you say, okay, well, there we are, there's the Samaritans number, there you go, off you go. But I mean, just in terms of making a safety plan, it's really important that that number's available. Papyrus is available as well. I think that's for people under 30. Is that right, Siobhan?
Yeah, that's right. So particularly if you're working with families, it can be quite useful for young carers or sibling carers if they're part of that family dynamic.
Yeah. We've also mentioned the National Domestic Abuse Hotline there, which is specifically for women who are experiencing domestic violence, and also there's Respect, which is a similar helpline aimed at men. It doesn't have the same 24/7 availability that the National Domestic Abuse Hotline has, but we thought it was important to bring those up as well because sometimes the domestic violence is another issue that may compound the stresses and the strains that parent carers are feeling. So yeah, I think that's my bit, Siobhan. So I'll
Thanks,
hand back to
Dan.
you.
So just to sort of wrap up by saying that a lot of this work we're already doing, we're undertaking. So we're working with policymakers, we're having conversations with MPs about how do we improve some of these strategies and policies, how do we improve some of the support that's available and funding that's available at those sort of national levels. Also working with local authorities and integrated care boards to think about what's being done at a more local level. In terms of frontline practitioners, the challenge we have at the moment, or Dan mentioned, the importance of asking carers about suicide and the training to do that. There isn't carer-specific suicide prevention training at the moment. And if you've ever done a course like Assist or other suicide prevention training, you'll know that the focus is very much on supporting one person who's at risk of suicide. But we know that carers come as a set with the person they're caring for. In the case of parent carers, they come as a part of a family. And so there's that need to balance suicide prevention with safeguarding as well. So we're working with carers leads at the moment to develop some training that would be specific to carers, that would also build in that aspect of how do you ask about thoughts of homicide as well, and assess the risk of ending the child's life. And once that's been developed and tested with carers lead staff, the hope is that we can roll that out to other organisations around the UK. But in the meantime, the points that Dan's highlighted are the most important things: that listening. Most carers who we've spoken to who are at risk of suicide say all they need is a safe space to offload. They just need someone to listen. And that the research is a really powerful way to do that, to say to parent carers, I'm not asking because I think you're crazy. I'm not asking because I think you're weak. I'm asking because we know that 40% of parent carers feel this way. So really normalizing it and helping parent carers understand that this is not, an unexpected reaction. It's actually a really normal reaction to the really extreme situation that they find themselves in. So that's everything that Dan and I wanted to cover. I've put our contact details on the last slide. I'm really keen to open it up for questions now, also to hear your experiences of working with carers who might be at risk. As Dan said, there is really good practice going on. We'd love to hear of that. And also if there's anything else that you would like from researchers to support you in this way as we move forward. So Dan, I'll turn it back to you, then I'll stop sharing and turn it back to you to chair
Yeah.
that discussion.
Thank you. So, as you were talking, Siobhan, the chat was kind of buzzing away with lots of comments and questions. So, what I might do, if as a starting point, is start to go through some of those and give you a chance to kind of answer where there's questions or respond to some of the comments. So, the first question from Gillian Powell is: were there other demographic factors associated with suicide ideation, e.g., poverty, lack of support, and resources?
No, and we expected that there would be. We thought things like that would come out, perhaps carers who weren't in paid employment, single parents, and they really didn't. Those four things that I mentioned were all that came out as predictive factors. But it's really important to recognize too that the risk factors for thinking about suicide can sometimes be quite different from the risk factors for dying by suicide. So it may be that those things come out if we were to do an analysis around deaths. I also think it's really important to distinguish between what we see in sort of big survey studies and then what we see in qualitative work. So certainly in the interviews, parent carers talk about the impact of things like poverty, of a lack of support, of a lack of resources, of conflict with professionals, of, as Dan said, having to knock on multiple doors or tell your story over and over again. So they're definitely factors for individual carers, even if they're not coming out at that group level.
And a question related to this from Dr. Dawn Kavanagh is disability a risk factor too? And I'm guessing it's getting to the type of disability. Were there any correlations, for example, between caring for an autistic child and suicidal ideation?
No, so we deliberately in this study didn't put a limit. We didn't define disability or long-term illness. So we asked people, anyone who considered their child to be disabled or to have a long-term illness to participate. And then we asked what was the nature of the condition. And there really wasn't any difference across conditions. What we do see in the interviews, though, is where parents have multiple children with disabilities, that can often increase the risk. As children age, if those conditions include violence against the parent or other siblings, that can heighten the risk. But there didn't seem to be a difference between conditions like autism versus, say, something like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome.
I'm a parent carer of a disabled young adult living in Cardiff, mother of 2 children, full-time worker. Siobhan's presentation rings very true. I'm very pleased that research in this field is being conducted. While I appreciate this was an England-only study, I hope there is interest from Cardiff University to conduct a study of parents of disabled children in Wales. If you don't mind, Siobhan, I'll
That's
just
a
comment
you question, Dan.
about Cardiff University's work. One thing I would certainly say is that I think the messages from this study cut across to Wales as well. Although it didn't include Welsh participants, I think the issues are similar enough, across the whole of the UK that I think we can take these messages forward. And certainly, I have recently joined the ministerial advisory group on carers. And so it's something that I'm definitely going to be talking about in those sorts of meetings. And and already have done with sort of people within Welsh Government. In terms of ongoing projects, my job tends to focus predominantly on adult social care rather than on social care for children and families. So I was just looking across at the CASCADE website. CASCADE is the Cardiff University Centre for Research into Children's Social Care. I can't see anything about parent carers there at the moment, but certainly I will take your comment forward and share with colleagues that there is appetite for more research on there.
Yeah, that's great. And I should say the separate project that was around deaths by homicide and homicide suicide, that did include Wales. So we certainly see those cases happening. So there is some evidence around that from the Welsh context.
And a question from Alison Milne. Are there areas where very good services exist for disabled or ill children, where you can identify that there are fewer suicides amongst parent carers? Or is that something you've not been able to explore?
I mean, I think if we had death data, we could absolutely be looking at that, I think. But without the death data, we're really limited to thinking about suicidal thoughts. In terms of suicidal thoughts, we asked about region, so we asked where people were living, but we could only do it at the really broad level. So Midlands, Devon, Cornwall, those sorts of things, which is really not small enough to be sort of identifying areas of good practice. The reason we didn't go smaller, we would love to have asked people for sort of, the first part of their postcode, or, where their GP practice was. But the carers that we co-produced the study with were very clear that they felt that those things were potentially identifying participants, particularly people whose child had a rare genetic condition or lived in a quite remote area. So that was something they really encouraged us not to do, to go to that more fine-grained analysis. So at the moment, we don't have that, which is unfortunate, because it would be amazing to link that and see if good practice is actually reducing risk.
Thank you. From Dr. Dawn Kavanagh, carer's strategy in Wales is meaningless. For example, you can't get a carer's assessment, and mentions that a case, it sounds like, where someone was sectioned before the carer could get an assessment, and that sectioning came about in as a result of a lack of respite and support. Um, if I can just speak for Wales, I mean,
Mhm.
certainly I think there is awareness both among local authorities and among Welsh Government that the amount of carers assessments being done seem to vary hugely across local authorities, and the nature of services offered to carers does seem to be very inconsistent. So there is an appetite to address that. And at the moment, the Centre for Adult Social Care Research in Cardiff University has got a bid under consideration for funding to explore why and how carers assessments are happening the way they are happening in Wales. So hopefully more work will be done on that. But there is awareness that things in that regard aren't good enough yet. From Gillian Powell, Carers Trust have been running two Welsh Government funds which allow carers to apply for a small amount of money to take a short break. This includes a cinema trip through to a weekend away. Carers will often choose to take breaks with the person they care for, but the evidence from our surveys suggests a reduction in isolation, stress, and depression. And I think that possibly speaks to the point about the importance of being able to have fun together.
Mm. I agree. I think in, 15 years of doing research on carers, respite is the thing that comes out in every single piece of research, that the vast majority of carers say they could keep going if they could just have a regular break. And not just a break, but a break where the replacement care is high quality. They don't come home to discover things are worse than when they left. It's regular. It's not, once a year. It's once a month or more regular than that, delivered by people who know what they're doing. The other challenge we see, particularly in England, but I'm assuming it's the same in Wales, is even where people can get the money for short breaks or a PA, the services are not often available to spend that money on. So I think there's multiple issues there around accessing short breaks, but when carers can, it's incredible.
Thank you. And on that note, as a parent carer, I have felt very isolated and despairing. It was only last year that I came across this group, ALN Charity, in the Cardiff and Vale area, linking inclusive families through social events, which found on Facebook, that places emphasis on families of children with disabilities to enjoy events together.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And what we heard from a lot of parent carers in the interviews and also from the parent carers who co-produced the research with us was how difficult it is and how depressing it is to have to always present the worst version of their child in order to get support. So as well as not being able to have fun themselves, they're also not getting to celebrate everything that's amazing about their child, that their child is an amazing artist or a talented musician or really creative. And so I think that getting to have fun, not just for the carer, but fun as a family and celebrating everything that's amazing about their kids is really important too.
Really important point here too, and believe us too. We don't feel believed. And she adds, for me, it has been about my son not belonging in the local school and the merry dance of having the responsibility to find a school that can accommodate my son. This merry dance displaced me and our family from our local community systematically.
Yeah. I agree about the not being believed. I think that's really common, and I think we have to be working particularly with local authorities, but also with with MPs and governments to say carers are the experts on their own lives, on their children's lives, on their children's conditions, and you have to trust them when they say they're in crisis. You have to trust them when they say they can't keep going. And I've certainly had some meetings with MPs recently where it's been evident that they don't trust that carers are saying that. There is very much this view that carers are whinging, or parent carers are trying, that idea of trying to get the golden ticket by asking for an EHCP, and it's just not true. I think from the carers that we work with and the parent carers, it takes so much for them to ask for help, and they really only ask when they've absolutely run out of other options. So yeah, I agree. Believing parent carers when they tell us they're struggling is so important. Oh, so I've just seen Dawn said about autistic parents. Yeah, we don't actually have any data on that about We did ask whether parents had their own long-term illnesses or disabilities, and that it didn't come out as a predictive factor in the survey, but it's certainly something in the interviews that parents talked about their own health needs, if they were also neurodivergent, not getting support for their own well-being. And I think certainly in terms of suicide risk, if carers are struggling with their own health issues or their own disabilities and they're not getting support, that can definitely exacerbate and contribute to thoughts of suicide, and particularly to thoughts of homicide, suicide.
Thank you. And apologies, Dawn, for misunderstanding your comment earlier on. I do apologize for that. And I've had two done, and I presume you mean carers assessments. I've had two done with recommendations being made, but still no support. And this has been going on for 3 years. Yeah, and I'm sorry to read that. I think one of the problems is that a carer's assessment alone, it ought to be the start of support, but clearly that isn't always happening. I don't know how things are in England in that regard, Siobhan.
Sorry, say that again. I was reading the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, the carers assessment's not necessarily leading to the support that people were hoping for.
Yeah,
That's an experience that seems to be reported here in Wales. Making that research into carers assessments, I think,
yeah.
all the more important. But I don't know.
So I think that the last piece of work that was done in England said that only about 30% of carers had actually had an assessment, and that most of the carers who had, something like 67%, probably more, said that nothing had changed as a result. So yeah, carers assessments are really not fit for purpose. There is at the moment, certainly in England, the Law Commission. The government has asked the Law Commission to review the legislation on disabled children's social care. They've just done a big consultation on that. And part of that was about how do we improve assessments and how do we make sure people are getting them. Also making sure that child assessments and parent assessments and sibling assessments are all sort of happening within the one space and are all connected. So there is some work being done on that. But change takes huge amounts of time, and I'm not under any illusion that Dan and I are going to fix things overnight with this one study. But I think what this piece of research in particular does is really put a clear number around this problem. I think we often hear some of the big carer charities talking about carers being at breaking point or carers being on their knees. And I think the problem with those, they're euphemisms, and the problem is that they're very fuzzy terms. And I think when you describe a problem in fuzzy terms, you get fuzzy solutions. And so I think what this research allows charities and professionals and advocacy groups and everyone else to do is say, no, it's 40% of parent carers who are thinking about suicide. You cannot ignore that number. It's not a euphemism. And now something needs to happen. So I think, we're seeing this very much as something that we can offer the community to say, use this number, take it forward, use it in your advocacy.
Thank you. And Helen commented, picking up on wellbeing and fun. Runner's World did an article back in the autumn about carers who were finding difficulty due to caring responsibilities in pursuing running. So yeah, just goes to show no matter what the activity, people just struggle to get that time for themselves, really.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And another comment from Helen. In Swansea, there is a parent carer forum for families, and she's posted the email address there in the chat. It's info@swanseapcf, all one word, .org. So
that's great. Thanks, Helen. I should say the parent carer forums were fantastic in supporting this research and getting the survey out to parent carers, really connecting us with carers who we wouldn't have reached in any other way. So the parent carer forums are a great source of support for lots of people. I know some of them are also doing incredible advocacy work. So Dan mentioned the carer strategy and the suicide prevention strategy. Although nothing's really happening at a national level, what we are seeing is local levels starting to recognise carers as a priority group. So Leeds, as a result of this piece of research, have put carers as a priority group in their new suicide prevention strategy. The Parent Carer Forum in Enfield has been very vocal about this, and it's now going into the Enfield Carer strategy. And I think the Oxford, I can't remember what the other two letters are, but whatever the ICB around Oxford is, they're looking at it as well. So I think that's the other thing to be thinking about is although the change at that national level will be much slower, what can we be doing at more local levels to tackle some of these issues?
So is saying I run a parent carer Facebook group, joining the Dots Parent Carer Wales. We've been running for around 9 years, and there's a link to the Facebook site there, and that's only for parent carers. And they and she's posted the web page, the Facebook link there. So thank you for sharing that. It's incredible the amount of things that people do to support each other, isn't it?
And that is one of the things we heard in this research, particularly in the interviews, was parent carers saying the only people who understand are other parent carers, and the only people that you can feel safe to say you're thinking about suicide or you're thinking about ending your child's life are other parent carers. And I think those closed Facebook groups are a lifeline for so many parent carers. So if you're running one of those, that's incredible.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And a couple of comments coming in very kindly, just sort of saying that they welcome the research and the messages that we're trying to share. I think that's all of the sort of comments I can see
That's
that
great.
I think.
And I will ask Siobhan after the session to circulate the paper. So the paper that this research was based on, or that's been published about this research is open access, so it's free to access. There's also a 2-page policy brief that really distills this quite down. If you don't feel like reading the long academic paper, the policy brief is much more accessible. So I'll ask Siobhan to circulate that as well. And Dan and I are also really happy to work individually if there's organisations or groups who would like to think more about how they build this into their practice or into their advocacy work or their lobbying. Really happy to have some more one-to-one conversations if that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're out of questions and comments. I don't know if you
That's great. So I think the only then thing that I would say to wrap up, I started with a content warning, but also just a bit of a self-care reminder this afternoon. I think particularly if you're a parent carer and this session's brought up anything difficult for you, if you can find a moment in your afternoon or your evening just to do something nice for yourself, whether that's just grabbing a coffee, going for a walk, if there's sunshine where you are, going and standing in the sunshine for 5 minutes, just take a moment this afternoon to do something for yourself. Dan's put oh, I don't have the slide now. I'll put the slide back up just with the helpline numbers as well, in case anyone wants to jot those down. So there's the Samaritans, which is 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There's Papyrus, which is for people under 30, the National Domestic Abuse Hotline for women, and the Respect hotline for men who are experiencing domestic abuse. And they're all fantastic services. So I think that's all from us. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for your interest. I think Siobhan's put up in the end some feedback. So Siobhan, I'll hand over to you just to finish up, if that's okay.
Thank you, Siobhan and Dan. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating and for all your contributions. If you do have time just to very quickly answer the 3 questions, it helps us do a quick evaluation of your learning and experience today. Thank you, everyone, once again.
Thank you all for your participation this afternoon.